Good morning, everybody. This is Sally Ember, EDD, with Changes. Today is November 5th, 2014, and I am very pleased to have as our guest this morning, 10 o'clock Eastern Time if you're watching live, Victoria Noe. Victoria, say hi to everybody.
Hi, everybody.
What would you like everyone to know about you this morning?
Well, first, thank you for joining us early in the morning. I know it's earlier than for some of you than it is for others. Especially some of you may have been up late watching election returns, so thanks for joining us. I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. First of all, I am not a grief counselor. I have a master's degree in speech and dramatic art from the University of Iowa, and theater was my first career. I moved to Chicago, worked in the theater community there for a while, and then I sort of morphed from stage managing and directing into being a fundraiser. And I raised a lot of money. I did events, I did grant writing, and this was during the height of the AIDS epidemic in the late 80s, early 90s. So I was doing a lot of fundraising for those groups as well as for arts groups and education groups. After I got married and my daughter was born in 1994, I switched gears and I started selling children's books to Chicago public schools. And that was a 15-year career while my daughter was growing up. About 5.5 years ago, I was in a minor car accident and had a concussion. And it's classified as a mild traumatic brain injury. But what it meant was I was having trouble doing math. And for someone in sales, that's kind of a problem, even if you have computer programs to help you. So I wound up not doing that anymore and decided that it was time to keep a promise that I made to a friend of mine before she died. 8 years ago this week, my friend Del Chapman died. And while she was in remission the last time from ovarian cancer, we were having tea at our favorite coffee house one morning after we dropped our daughters off at school. And I told her I had an idea for a book. And the book would be about people who are grieving the death of a friend. Well, she thought it was a great idea and was very encouraging. I had never written a book before. And so I just sort of tried to forget about it after she died for a long time afterwards. And it was really not until I was recuperating from that concussion that I finally made the commitment to write the book. So I spent a couple years researching and interviewing people and pitching the book to agents. And those who were nice enough to respond all said the same thing. I don't know how to market this. And I thought, well, why am I bothering with you? Because I do know how to market this. And at the same time, I decided it wasn't going to be one book. It was going to be a series of little books. And each book was going to be a different situation. So in March of 2013, I published the first one, which was Friend Grief and Anger. And since then, there have been 3 more. I'm working on the 5th one as we speak. There will be a 6th one. I don't know if there will be more. The first one came out of a really universal feeling that a lot of people have when their friends die, and that's anger. It's one of Kubler-Ross's famous stages of grief, but it's probably the stage that most people try to skip over because it's not very well accepted. Anger is not an emotion that most people look at in a positive way, but it really is normal and has to be gotten through. After that, I did a book about losing friends to AIDS because I lost a lot, not nearly as many as other people have. After that, 9/11. Now, the interesting thing about the 9/11 book was I did lose a high school classmate on 9/11. But when I started researching and interviewing survivors, what I found out was that friends are officially kept out of the official observances in New York. Only family members are allowed to participate on the anniversary of 9/11 at the site of the memorial and now the museum. So that was kind of surprising to find that out. After that, I did the book about the military, and it turned out to be a different book than I thought it would be. Um, I assumed that PTSD was an issue. PTSD is not the problem when people in the military, active duty or veterans, are grieving their friends. It's something that's called moral injury. And the short version of moral injury is it's when your conscience, you do something against your conscience. And for these men and women in the military, it was being unable to save their friends. It was being unable to grieve their friends because they're in the middle of war. They can't stop and grieve. And that leads to all kinds of complications. The book I'm working on now is about workplace grief, about grieving friends you work with. It's a very, very, very broad definition of workplace. So I have Broadway performers, I have priests and nuns, I have members of, again, the military, I have a barista. You know, it's a very wide range of people in different kinds of professions. Like I said, I'm not a grief professional, and I think that this has really helped in my interviews with people. It has helped in the sense. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I really appreciate your giving us that overview and that background, and those are answers to a lot of the questions I would have asked. I'm showing people now some of the covers of your books that you mentioned that are on your website. And for those of you that are just joining us, this is Vicki Noe, and she is responsible for a series of books that are really filling a gap in the grief and loss category of human experience, in which we lose a friend or a colleague or someone close to us due to something that a lot of people don't want to talk about, such as HIV and AIDS, and what that creates in us. So her website is www.friendgrief.com. Friend grief is all one word. And so that's the way you can reach her and find out more about her books. And we're just saying, Vicki, is that you didn't come to this as somebody who was an author or somebody who was ready and willing to talk about psychology or sociology or any of the ways people come to grief counseling. You came as a writer of grants and as a performing artist supporter.
Yes, it was. It was funny because when I started pitching the original book to agents, they asked, you know, well, what are comparable books? Well, there aren't any comparable books. There's one book about grieving a friend, and it's a textbook. There was nothing out in the general trade, you know, shelves of Barnes and Noble or whatever about grieving a friend, and it really does fill a gap. I've had that reaction from so many people who looked for books and couldn't find them. Thank you, Rain.
Yeah, and two of our listeners are really appreciating that you shared your story about how this came to be, because it is a unique story that you got to talk to the friend who inspired it before she left our world, and that she not only was interested in it but really supported it. So,
well, she was a wonderful person. She was incredibly talented. She was a force of nature. November 7th, it's 8 years since she died. And she's always with me. And if you talk to any of her friends, they will say the first thing out of their mouth is, I feel her presence every day. She was that strong of a personality and so supportive of her friends and whatever they were doing.
So you had the idea. She was the reason that you had the idea. Yes. Then you had a number of years that intervened after she died, and you had this accident, which is another thing you and I have in common, because about 6 months ago, I had a fall in which I had a very serious concussion, and mine was on the front of my head, and it didn't affect my ability to do math only, although it did affect that, but it affected a lot of things, and I'm a writer, and one of the things it affected was it made me aphasic. for a long time. I couldn't find words. I couldn't find the right words, or I was mixing up words, or I was doing what my friends would call word soup, you know,
Yes.
saying what I thought was right and it wasn't right, or just talking around it to get to it. And I think that it happens a lot with writers, that we are catapulted into writing because of a series of what Lemony Snicket would call unfortunate events.
Yes. Yes.
That,
And not just writing, not just a lot of the people that I talk about in the books are not just telling the story of their friend who died. They're telling the story of how that person's life and death affected them, and
yes,
how they made changes in their lives. I'm not the only one. You know, lots of people they've changed careers, they've moved, they've taken up new causes. They've just, you know, even if it's just being more cognizant of how precious time is. But every person I've talked to has said in some way that their life changed because of that friend.
well, and we have another comment from a watcher today. Scott, thank you for being here. And he is saying that he's surprised that more people haven't written about this, because obviously it affects everyone, and people just don't realize that grief includes losing a friend. And
Well,
it's
yeah.
important, and I think that's really true. And Rain is asking if you have made your grief books available in a read aloud format as a podcast or on YouTube or in audio format. Any chance of that happening?
There is. It is on my list for the first of the year. I'm not going to do audio versions of the book until the series is done and do them all as one. That at least that's the plan right now. I may still do podcasts. They're obviously available in print and ebooks, but there are lots of. I'm learning more and more about what the possibilities are, and podcasts is definitely one. After the holidays.
Well, you know, it also brings up an interesting point that I think Sheila Strover is making, and thank you for commenting and visiting this morning, Sheila, as you have many times on Changes HOA. The Grief Club is a book that she said she enjoyed, and I think that's a fiction book, if I'm not mistaken. And I do believe there are lots and lots of fiction books that deal with loss and grief of a friend. Isn't that true?
There are, and there are also the nonfiction books that are out there tend to be one person talking about one friend, rather than sort of a global idea of grieving the death of a friend.
Right, like you have the movie Beaches, which comes from the book Beaches,
Absolutely.
which is one friendship.
Right, absolutely. That is the typical type of nonfiction book that's written about grieving a friend. But yes, I mean, there are lots of, you know, fiction books about grieving a friend. The Harry Potter books, it's all over Harry Potter.
It's true. There's a lot of loss and death of friends and colleagues in those books. And when you were just talking, it reminded me that if you're going to write about losing a friend in a nonfiction way, then it can't just be a memoir. It can't just be the story of I'm Vicky and I lost my friend and I'm sad.
Right.
So how did you not do that? Because that certainly would have been what most people would do.
Well, I knew that no one would care about that. You know, I mean, other than me, I would care about it, but no one else would care about it. So I had to make an effort to make it universal and make it something that people could easily relate to. And that's why when I wrote the military book, I tell stories that go back to the Civil War. You know, grieving your friend is nothing new. It is nothing new. In fact, you can go back to the ancient Greeks and read accounts of soldiers losing their friends. So, excuse me, it had to be examples that people could relate to. I do have some of my own experiences. In the first three books, the military book, I had no real strong personal connection to that experience since I haven't served in the military. But the other books, you know, were definitely based in my own experience, but not limited to that. You can't, if you do that, then I think you're really limiting the possibility that people can identify with it.
Well, you and I talked before the broadcast started about the idea that it really is difficult to lose a friend, but it's very difficult to lose a friend when the circumstances are complicated. And certainly 9/11 and the military would fall into those categories where they were unexpected or strange situations or losses in which you're the only survivor, or you didn't expect someone to be in danger and then they're in danger. And that same thing happens when someone's a victim of a crime or a car accident, say DUI, where it wasn't really an accident, somebody was irresponsible.
Right.
And killed your friend and killed other people as well sometimes. So in those situations and in many other situations, that element of anger, as you said, is huge.
Well, it is, and it's really necessary. People will suppress that anger almost all the time. And the problem with it is that it comes back. It will come back when you least expect it. It will come back in a really inappropriate way at an inappropriate time. And suppressing the anger also can be related to the stigma around the person who died or how they died. There are, like I said, I worked in the AIDS community for a long time, and the stigma is still there. 30 plus years later, the stigma is still there. It's not quite what it was in the 80s, but it's still there.
Well, when you say it's still there, what you mean is it's there because of homophobia and heterosexism, where people have already judged harshly the lifestyle and the orientation of these men, mostly, who died. Right. And then they forget, for one thing, that lots of other people have died of AIDS, not just gay men. And lots of other people are living with HIV, not just gay men. But even if we were completely welcoming and accepting of all sexual orientations and lifestyles, the previous negativity really did create a stigma around HIV and AIDS that was undeserved.
Absolutely. And it is still out there. It really is still out there. At the age of 60, I joined ACT UP in New York because I'm in New York a lot, and there's no chapter in Chicago anymore. I was not an AIDS activist back in the day. I was too busy raising money. But now I am. And I see the same stigma out there. Like I said, not quite to the same extent. It's bad enough that your friend died, but when you cannot share that grief with other people because they will immediately judge harshly the person who died, is very, very painful.
Well, you know what I've found to be true is that when you lose a friend to peculiar circumstances, peculiar meaning not run-of-the-mill, not what happens to most people. Like, a lot of people understand that people get heart attacks, strokes, even cancer is so commonplace now. Nobody thinks twice about that. It's horrible. But they don't ask a lot of questions and wonder what that person did to get a heart attack or a stroke or a cancer. I mean, usually. Although obesity does fit into it and the judgments come in at that time. But let's put that aside for a minute. What I wanted to talk about was what happens when someone is in a situation that is risky, or is perceived by others to be a matter of choice, and then they die, or they're murdered, or there's an accident. Then you've got that complication, right?
Well, the anger comes up, and also the guilt. There's a lot of survivor guilt, not just in the military community, but in the AIDS community too. I know a lot of people, gay and straight, men and women, who have been HIV positive since the late 80s or early 90s, and their friends are gone. Their friends are gone. They're all gone. They had to start over all over again making friends. A lot of people in the military, a lot of first responders on 9/11. Some of them were criticized for going down to the World Trade Center because they weren't on duty. They didn't have to be there. They weren't called in. They went of their own accord. And because of that, there was a lot of anger. Why did they have to do that? Why did they go down there? They didn't have to be there. And that really, your grief gets stopped in its tracks because you're so consumed by guilt and anger.
Yeah, and then, then there's what you call traditional grief, or the honorary grief of losing a child. And Sheila reminds me that the book I mentioned before, Grief Club, is not a fiction book. It was written by Melody Beatty, who's a very big writer and author in the addiction community. And she had lost her son, apparently, and wrote this book. Thank you, Sheila, for explaining that. And so, again, it's like if someone loses a child, especially a child who's under the age of 18 and just doing regular things, living their life, nobody thinks twice about consoling them and giving them comfort, and nobody asks a lot of questions. But what if you lose your child to race car driving the way Paul Newman did, or to mountain climbing, or to voluntary service in first responders in the military when they weren't on duty or didn't have to be? Then what do you say to someone who loses that friend or relative?
Well, you're right. I mean, it complicates everything. And, what complicates it, when it's your friend, is that grief is generally not as well respected by others. I have a friend who was supposed to give the eulogy at his best friend's funeral. He couldn't get off work to do it. They wouldn't let him off work to do it. Bereavement.
Right, there is no compassionate leave. Right, like we call it compassionate leave in the workplace. If you get to take a vacation day or a personal day or whatever to go deal with it. Rain is saying she really appreciates you bringing up the AIDS and HIV issues and bringing awareness around the importance of grieving. And I think there is more awareness that needs to be brought because people aren't getting the time off from work and people aren't getting the recognition from other friends and colleagues about the significance of this loss.
When I was only going to write the one book and not all these little books, the working title of the book was "It's Not Like Their Family," and which is the attitude of so many people when you lose a friend. Well, what's the big deal? It's not like they were in your family. It's not like it was your mother. It's not like it was your kid. How bad can it be? And it's horrible. And thank you, Rain. I mean, it's. I've been getting involved more in the AIDS community and the issue of longtime survivors. And I did a reading and book signing in New York in June. And it was supposed to be sort of a 20-minute general discussion. It turned into a 2.5-hour discussion. And it was all about suppressing the grief over the decades and how. And it's an interesting story. In the last, I'd say, 3 years, all of a sudden, people in the AIDS community are finally talking about their experience. They're finally grieving. And like the military, they had to suppress that because they were in the middle of a war, really. And they put it aside.
I want to add in that the political climate in the world has changed about gays and lesbians and about acceptance, which I think has opened the door for many of us, I should say, because I'm bisexual, to talk more about our personal experiences without fear of reprisal and with an expectation of acceptance.
Yes. I mean, and that has definitely helped. What happened to really open the floodgates was the death of one of the members of ACT UP, Spencer Cox, and who, he stopped taking his medication, basically, is what happened. And that was 3 years ago, I believe. And his funeral was a catalyst. And several books. Mine's not the only book that's come out. There have been other books as well, by mostly men, men who were my heroes in the 80s and thank God are still around. But it's really only been in the last 3 years. I've known people for 20 years who had no idea that I worked in the AIDS community because I never talked about it. Because people didn't care.
Well, what's interesting about that, too, is that in the Buddhist community in San Francisco, there's a San Francisco Zen Center. And Scott Snowcroft brings up this topic to me, embracing grief is not to fear death. Well, Buddhism, we talk all the time about death. Impermanence is one of the 4 truths we talk about, that everything dies, everything ends. But to say that and to feel that aren't the same thing. And so one of the things the San Francisco Zen community decided to do was start a hospice and train all of their meditators and all of their community members in working in some part of the hospice. And what they decided to focus on for the first 15 or 20 years, if not still, were HIV and AIDS patients for that hospice, which was fabulous because look where they are, San Francisco, right? It was one of the places that had the worst attrition and death rate of any city in the world for people dying and being sick from HIV and AIDS. And I think that many books have been written about that experience for the workers, for the meditators, but not many from the point of view of losing a personal friend.
Right. It's a very complicated thing, and I thank him for that comment too. It's people have said to me, they look at the books and they're like, "Oh, this is really depressing." It's like it's not depressing. Some of the stories are sad because you lost a friend. Why wouldn't it be sad? But they're also very uplifting because the people in my books didn't just grieve their friend. They dedicated their lives to the memory of their friends.
Mm-hmm.
That friendship meant so much to them. There's a guy, he hasn't shown up in any of these books yet. He's going to be in the book about men grieving their friends. He was living in Paris. He was rehabbing old apartment buildings, high-end apartments. He was 29 years old, great life, right? His best friend died. He quit his job, moved back to the States, married his girlfriend, and changed careers because he realized that he had to carry on because his friend couldn't. And what he'd been doing was not really what he was supposed to do.
Well, there's a beautiful song that Holly Near wrote in the 70s, It Could Have Been Me.
Mm-hmm.
And the lyrics to that are, it could have been me, but instead it was you. So I'll keep doing the work I was doing as if I were too.
Yes.
And then she goes on, and every verse is about someone who was killed or who died too soon, who was an activist, a poet, a writer, had some great work they were doing in the world, some good heart they were contributing, and it was cut off. So then the rest of us who are left, we survivors, do feel that we want to carry on behalf of the people who can't.
Well, especially when they die, what we consider to be young or before their time or whatever. It doesn't even matter how they died. It's just the fact that they died. One of the most gratifying things to me when I do a book signing or I do a reading is the people who come up to me and, hopefully they buy the book too, but they tell me a story about their own friend and what that friendship meant to them, I'm sorry. And it's just, I love to hear the stories. I absolutely love to hear the stories.
Mm-hmm. So do people come to your website? Is there a place on friendgrief.com where people just tell their stories?
Well, I haven't set it up like that. I mean, they can certainly comment to posts that I put up there. I'm in the process of redoing my website. And so the first of the year, it's going to be much more interactive. And even if there's not a place where people can actually post their own stories, they can always email me, or send me
a page on Facebook, don't you?
Pardon me?
You have a page on Facebook.
Yes.
And so people could put comments or stories up there, or even when I was doing the promotions for this HOA for changes that you were going to be on, I was looking for groups to post it in on Google Plus and on LinkedIn and on Facebook, and I was really surprised by how few groups there are that are devoted to the loss of a friend or to friendship and loss, or there were a lot devoted to grief, especially losing a child.
Yes.
There were some devoted to suicide.
Yes.
And of course I did post on all those sites because grief is grief, but I was interested in the fact that there didn't seem to be a Vicky Noe group. Are you thinking of starting one, or would you want to start one?
It's possible. It's just, it's something that happens to all of us. I mean, everybody loses their friends. It's, my dad was the first one in his group to die, and he was 75, and to see his friends rally around him was really wonderful. See these guys, who I know my whole life, rally around him. But it's not something that most people focus on or talk about because, like I said, people don't always get why you're so upset that your friend died. Mutual friends, even mutual friends might not.
Well, and I think that happens also with children, and Scott brings up an important point and wants to know if you're planning on another focus for your series to look at what do children do when they've lost a friend to accidents or cancer or murder or a fire or any of the dozens of ways kids can die. Do you address that at all?
No, I don't. And the reason is because I think the process of grieving for a child is so different than for an adult. There are so many things to consider, and I really believe that that is something best left to grief professionals. Uh, it can be very, very complicated by the family dynamic and a lot of things, and I don't feel qualified to do that. Um,
Well, I
there's,
know there are books written about and for the children who lose a sibling. And I don't have those titles in my head. But if anybody does or wants to point us to where they are, please put that in the comments because that might be useful to Scott or other people looking for those.
but there is a lot of work out there with adolescents and young adults. It's estimated that 25% of college students will lose a family member while they're in school. Um, and which is probably a grandparent, but maybe a parent. So that kind of a grief is being addressed much more than it used to be.
Well, and I
Um,
think we can't ignore the violence that happens all throughout the lives of people who live in gang territories or military situations all around the world who are losing people every day to
well,
violence.
I have a friend who has a daughter who's 19. She's lost 4 friends to drug overdoses.
And there are those who are lost to accidents or
Right.
intentional self-harm, who are
Exactly.
lost to all
But I
different kinds of risky behavior failures.
Yes, and I just feel like, for young people, children, adolescents, there are so many factors playing into what they're going through and their grief for their friends that it's beyond my pay grade, as they say.
Well, what about when you lose a friend to something that's really hard to talk about, like that auto asphyxiation that some people do when they're trying to have a sexual experience and then they die seemingly by accident, or that kids were doing with each other, the choking game is what they call it, a horrible name,
Yeah.
for hurting each other, or people who race cars, or people who bungee jump and the cord breaks, or what do you do with that kind of grief?
Well, what I do with that, what I hope people can do is to immediately move beyond the stigma of how that person died. When I was working in the AIDS community and I would say, oh, so-and-so died, the first question out of anybody's mouth was, how did they get it?
Oh.
And my response was always, what difference does it make? They're dead. And
Well, okay, but I know what difference it makes. People want to know how someone died because
yeah,
they want to think that they can avoid it themselves.
yeah,
They want
absolutely.
control.
And not just avoid it, they want to feel sort of morally superior to it. Maybe not morally, but in some way feel like they're better than that person. And that's got no business in the conversation. And that's why I would shut the conversation down immediately.
Well,
It
see, I'm going
doesn't
to
matter.
challenge that. No,
Come
no,
on,
I'm going to
it doesn't
challenge
matter
that.
how they died.
I'm going to challenge that not because you're wrong, but because it comes up all the time. So shutting it down doesn't mean it goes away. Those
No,
feelings,
I'm not saying
those
it doesn't go.
questions, those thoughts, they are a natural part of anybody's death. How
Yeah,
did it happen?
yeah.
When my friends were murdered, my friends are now dead 25 years. They were on vacation. They had a lot of ability to take a vacation. They were both therapists. They were in their late 30s. They're lesbians. And they were on vacation in a remote island, and they were murdered by someone who was developmentally disabled and violent. So
Hmm.
look at all the complications of
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Okay? So where do you go with that? Like, people were blaming and casting blame and looking at it in so many different perverse ways, and the fact was my friends were murdered. That's
Right.
really all I wanted to talk about. It was horrifying. But they wanted to say, oh, well, look, they had privilege, or look, he's retarded, or look, there's this, he's black and they're white, or he's poor and they're rich. I mean, on and on and on. And none of that should have mattered, but it all came up.
I like to think sometimes it's because people are struggling to find meaning, some kind of meaning in it, but oftentimes it's just, you know, this sort of disgusting thing that a lot of us have, maybe all of us have, like we want to know all the gory details and then somehow pass judgment on somebody. All that matters, you're right, all that matters, the bottom line is that your friends were murdered. That's all they need, that's all anybody needs to know. That's all anybody needs to know. They
But
were
we just went that feeling sometimes to create distance between
Oh,
us and the thing. Like, oh, they got cancer, but they got it from asbestos. I've
yes,
never been around asbestos, so I don't have to worry.
right,
Right? So
right.
there's all that going on too.
You know, there's everybody tries to blaming the victim is very popular. You know, I mean, I know people who, like I said, I had a high school classmate who died on 9/11. I know people who insisted that it was her fault that she died. That if she had just left the building immediately, she would have been okay.
Oh my God.
And it was, you know, what I found in my research, she was in the South Tower. People in the South Tower survived depending on what side of the building their office was on. They had 14 and a half minutes before the second tower was hit. You know, that's not a lot of time to think about what your reaction is going to be to something you didn't even see.
And they had
So,
100
you know, there's
floors, right? Weren't there 104 floors? I mean, how are
yes.
you going
Well,
to
she
get
was
anywhere in 14 minutes?
right. They didn't have a lot of time, but you'd be surprised at the blame that is directed toward some of the people who died that day. You would be surprised.
Well, there was a fierce amount of fear. And I
Yeah.
think that the very next step, or even without stopping at fear, people go right to anger.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
Which brings us to
And
your topic at the
it
very
was.
beginning.
It's very. It's very difficult for people to process anger as part of their grief because it's not accepted. It's not pretty.
Mm-hmm.
And I said this, you know, I think in the AIDS book, I was asked to write a piece that was part of AIDS at 30 series in Windy City Times in Chicago. It's the gay and lesbian newspaper, and I've known the publisher for a long time. And she asked me to write about my remember anything. That was a long time ago. I sat down at the computer and you could see the smoke rising out of the keyboard. I could not type fast enough. And the problem was the anger came out. Now, luckily, I was able to channel the anger, but in the meantime, I was shocked by the depth of the anger that I felt. Um, and I think that if we're really honest, that whenever someone we love, member, friend, even if it's a celebrity we've never met, we're angry. That's part of it. It's part of Kubler-Ross's, stages of grief. Whether you believe in them or not, anger is a part of it. And I think that until we can accept that, it's going to be more difficult to work through over it. I never would ever tell anyone to get over it. But it's still a very, very difficult emotion for people to deal with when they're grieving. It's it is not pretty, but it's necessary. I mean, I've been angry a lot. Sometimes I've been angry at the person who died. Sometimes I've been angry at the doctors. Sometimes I've been angry at the family member. Your anger can be directed anywhere. Um, but I think the important part is that you acknowledge it and use that sort of as a fuel, you know, to get you through the whole process. If that makes any
Well, I'm
sense.
sorry, I just got kicked out and now I'm back. Thank you for continuing. That was helpful. So you were talking more about anger. I think that's the part I missed. Mm-hmm. And what do you do when people read your book and they come to that part of what do I do next? What do you recommend once they've finished the book, kind of thing?
Well, what I would like for people to do is to use the books to identify, first of all, to identify with the people in the books and their situations. Second, to be able to make the connection between their own experience and other people's experience. It's not that it has to be the same. Everybody's experience is different, but there are going to be similarities. Whether it's anger, whether it's survivor guilt, whatever it is, there are going to be similarities. And to recognize that that means that they're not alone. So I've talked to so many people who, in so many different situations, who thought they were the only ones who felt this way, that other people did not grieve their friends like they did. They thought there was something maybe kind of weird about them because they felt this so deeply. Or maybe that they felt the need to suppress it because other people didn't understand it.
I think you bring up a good point that a lot of people don't know how to manage grief in general, but we especially don't know what the parameters are when we lose a friend. We don't know what's an appropriate amount of time, what's an appropriate amount of intensity, how much are we supposed to talk about it, how much are we supposed to show. None of that is a given for any of us.
Exactly. It's not. There's no guidebook for this, and I'm not implying that my books are a guidebook for this, but I think that they're an opportunity for people to identify with others who are going through the same things.
Well, and so then Rain brings up a good point, which is because this is so difficult and so many people have these problems, when you feel like it or when other people feel like it, what about opening a Google Plus group about grief or friend grief? Or what about having an opportunity to talk about that on your website or on Facebook or
Absolutely.
something like that?
I'd be glad to put it out there to see what kind of interest there is. Absolutely.
Well, it's hard to believe because I know it feels like we just started, but we only have about 15 more minutes at this point. And this is the time when I want to invite you to remind people, Vicki, of how to reach you and what else is coming up for you in the way of public appearances and book releases. So let us know about you again.
My blog is friendgrief.com, friendgrief.com, all one word. My books are available, paperback and ebooks, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, IndieBound, Kobo, soon to be iTunes and Google Play. It's very, you can contact me through the website. That's probably the easiest way to do it. If you're in the Chicago area, I will be part of the Chicago Book Fair held on the first Saturday of December at Columbia College downtown.
I'm going to put that in the comments so people can find that. Columbia College, and do you know the dates?
It's the first Saturday in December, which I believe is the 6th.
And you're going to be there with a booth or a vendor kind of a situation?
There will be a lot of authors there. It's a free event.
Okay, I'm putting that in there so people can find it.
On World AIDS Day, which is December 1st, it's the Monday after Thanksgiving, I will be moderating a panel at Women and Children First Bookstore in Chicago. And the topic of the discussion is the generation gap in the AIDS community.
Wow, that's a great topic. If you could put more about that, it'll be on your website, right?
Yes. Yes, we're just finalizing the details. We confirmed the third speaker on Monday, so we'll have details by the end of the week.
Great.
And then I'll be in New York in January, but those dates are not firm yet.
Oh, okay. So you're really doing quite a bit of traveling then, and you're making it so that people can find you in person as well as out in the world. So that's great.
Well, and I like I said, I love talking to people, and I'll have people. They'll pick up the book, they'll look at the cover, and they go, "Yeah, okay," and they nod, and they get it, And so I love talking to people. Obviously, I like to talk.
Okay. Well, do you want to talk another moment or so, because we have a comment here from Scott who's asking a question about what about the correlation between the denial of grief and the fear of death? That's quite a philosophical question, but we do have a few minutes here if you'd like to address that, Vicki.
I think it's a very interesting connection. We as a society, Western society, do not generally grief or death. We're really bad at death, and grief is looked at oftentimes, especially for men, as a weakness. Men are allowed to grieve a little bit in certain ways, but there's a real time limit on it. What people who are grieving will most often hear from other people is, you need to get over it. You need to move on. And rather than work through it at your own pace, everybody needs the luxury of doing that. And for a lot of people, it feels like a luxury to grieve.
Well, you really bring up an important point, because we're back to that issue of how much time do people get off work, how much time do people get from other friends and family to deal with their grief. It's a big deal no matter whom you're grieving, but it's especially not given when you're grieving a friend.
Yes, yes. It's the next book is on workplace grief, and I did a lot of research into workplace policies on bereavement leave, and I only found one company that actually specified friend. You got one day off, but it was for a friend, and it's too bad that they can't, companies can't just have, here's compassionate leave, use it however you want.
Well, people definitely not feel good about that because of all the ways it could be abused, but I agree with you, it should be an option. And that could bring us to our final question of our discussion today, where I give you a bit of a platform and I ask you the big question I ask every one of my Changes Hangouts on Air guests, which is, given all of the local, personal, regional, national, global, political, social, environmental, and spiritual, and any other kind of changes you're aware of, which ones arouse your hopes and fears? Which ones do you want to speak about right now to our listeners today and in the future listening to this archived on YouTube? Victoria Noe, this is your time.
Well, I think the thing that gives me the most hope is, without sounding like an old fogey, is the millennial generation. I have a daughter who's 20, and I see the passion in her and her friends to fight injustice, to promote equality for everybody, to promote peace and understanding. And I just hope that they keep it that way, that they don't get jaded, that they don't get cynical, and they carry on the work that they're beginning. I am constantly impressed by the work coming out of that generation. I know they get a lot of bad press, and I'm not sure why, because I see a lot of very, very positive things in them. They're willing to talk about things. I did a sort of an analytical thing on my blog to see the ages of the people who were coming to my blog. I assumed they would be around my age. They would be baby boomers. They're not. They're 25 to 40. And that's a little bit older than most millennials, but it shows me that there is a lot of interest on the part of younger people to approach difficult subjects in a new way, to embrace diversity, to embrace openness about everything. I mean, there is nothing they won't talk about. They don't tolerate showboaters. They don't tolerate divas. They want to have real substantive discussions and change about important issues. And that gives me so much hope.
Well, I think I would agree with you that the millennials are where we need to and would like to place our hope. But after the results of yesterday's election all around the country, I have to say that that hope may be misplaced, at least for midterm elections, because the turnout was terrible for that age group.
It was, and we'll have to wait for the analysis to see what the new voting laws had to do with that. I
Good
know
point.
it. I know in a couple of states it did. I think in general, it's difficult to get people to come out for midterm elections
Yeah.
because they feel unless there's a presidential election, it's not important. And I think it behooves all of us to, whatever their political persuasion, to educate people on the importance of these elections, because as time goes on, people will realize the impact that the results have given us, um, whether you like them or not.
Well, you
Um,
brought up a good point a minute ago, too, about what the role of millennials might be in bringing more things out into the public conversation.
yes,
And that does
absolutely,
give me a lot of hope.
absolutely, yeah,
Putting things into the internet world and online more certainly makes things more public, but I think there's also a willingness, and maybe you could fault it if you're interested in privacy or not liking premature or inappropriate disclosure, but there is certainly a higher willingness to be more forthright, to be more
yes.
forthcoming, to disclose all kinds of private things to people.
Well, and for good or bad, they believe there's nothing you can't discuss.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not. Maybe they shouldn't discuss everything on the internet, but there's no topic they want to avoid. They want to talk about everything, and it's not just learning about it; it's solving problems. And
Yes.
and we cannot afford to shut them down or discourage them.
I agree, and I think that is a major change, and I think that we are only just beginning to see how that is impacting so many cultures around the world, but that's certainly how the Arab Spring happened. That's
Yeah,
certainly how a lot of change in Hong Kong is being fostered. That's certainly the way many changes, political and social, are happening in small and large regions around the world, and many of them are being dynamited out of denial and forced into conversations in public by millennials. So hallelujah for that.
one of the things I did, I haven't done it for a while because I've been too busy, was I have hosted death cafes. And a death cafe is a very informal group. It's like a salon. It's a movement that started in Switzerland and moved to the UK. It's all around the world now, and it's a very informal discussion about end of life issues and how you want to leave your legacy. And what we found in the death cafes that we hosted was that it was pretty evenly divided, men and women, but skewed younger than we expected.
Well, that is
We we had,
fascinating.
we had college students coming, we had young people coming. It was fabulous. It was absolutely fabulous. Death and grief are among the topics that young people want to talk about because that's one of the things that they typically get shut down about. Oh, you don't talk about it. You know.
Did you happen to see that video that went viral of that young woman who decided to end her life intentionally, and she moved to Oregon so that she could do it legally
Yes.
because she had a brain tumor and it was obvious how that was going to kill her and when it was going to deteriorate her life, and she actually did just end her life about 2 days ago,
Yeah.
about 2 days later than she originally had planned, but in the same week.
Right.
And certainly there's been a wave of discussion around euthanasia and self-determination of death and
Which is
all
great.
kinds of issues.
It needs to be talked about, and it's all good. I mean, it's messy. It's like the bishop synod in at the Vatican. It's like it was a messy discussion, but it was a discussion that needed to happen. And that's how I look at this. It's not going to be pretty, because everybody needs to weigh in on this and figure out their own way, but it's necessary.
Well, and then you bring in an important point, which is the religious piece of everything, the beliefs and the faith and the doctrine and the rigidity or flexibility that people come to the topic already carrying. And then what happens when we butt heads or come to the legal system or do whatever we do individually and collectively?
Well, it's when my friend Dell was dying, she said, this is where you figure out how much you really believe in what you thought you believe. It's are you really do you really believe what you've been taught your whole life?
Uh-huh.
And it led to some interesting discussions, with her friends. And
Well,
you know,
Rain is joining you in being optimistic about our millennials and calling them a gigantic wave of problem solvers.
absolutely,
And he agrees with you that that gives us a lot of hope.
yeah,
But I would also add that there's a gigantic wave of changing beliefs.
yes, yes. They rightly so. They have little faith in institutions, whether they're religious or political or commercial or whatever, financial. They have little faith in institutions, and they're finding their own way, and they're creating their own ways of doing things. And I think it's fascinating. I mean, I don't feel a generation gap with them at all. I feel very much supportive and understanding of what they're doing.
Yeah, and there are hot button topics, and Scott's agreeing with us that euthanasia is one of them. And you and I talked beforehand about voluntary participation in situations that can lead to death, and then people dying in those situations certainly creates other issues for the
Yes.
people who are left behind.
Hmm.
And what that means to everybody can vary. And then you get into the situations like, what about people who sign up to be mercenary military people, or volunteer for our own military, or volunteer to be first responders, or volunteer in any, those people that hang from helicopters to save people from drowning, or come and save them from mountain climbing problems and all that.
It's it goes and it all goes back to the stigma. It's are you going to blame them for doing something that they believed in? That unfortunately killed them. It's how much do you support your friends? I mean, I know friends. I've had friends who've done pretty risky things. Luckily, they didn't die doing them, most of them, but you know they believed in it, and you can't support someone to the point to just to a point. Either you support them or you don't.
That is a really good way to put it. And Buddhist teachers that I've heard talk about this, Judith Leaf from Naropa University opened a lecture I heard one time, and she said, "What is the leading cause of death?" And there was just dead silence in the room. And she wrote on the board, she wrote, "Being born."
Right.
Because everybody dies.
Yes.
And nobody escapes. So the
Right.
first cause, the only cause of death, is being born. And then I would add to that, and I've had discussions with people about this in person and online, that it isn't about the risk of death. That's not the way people should talk about risk. They should
Right.
talk about the risk of an.
Well, I mean, risk is everywhere. You take a risk just getting up in the morning. Everything you do on some level during the day is risky. Hopefully not dangerous, but whether it's you can fall in the shower, you can have a car accident, anything can happen. It's some people are more risk tolerant than others, but the truth of the matter is everybody risks every day. And families sometimes have more control over people who engage in risky behavior. Friends can be influential, but we don't want our friends to put themselves in danger. That's just the bottom line. We don't want them to do that, but that doesn't mean that we can't support them in doing something that they believe in. Um, Whether it's joining the military, whether it's skydiving, whatever it is, if they're doing something that is inherently bad for them, like shooting up drugs, that's different. But I think that again, that younger people are much more vocal about expressing their opinions on this, whether it's calling somebody out because they're doing something dangerous, whether it's supporting them doing something risky that's ultimately good for them, whether it's expressing their affection for their friends. It's, I just keep looking to younger people, and that's maybe my generation gap, is that I feel that my generation has did really well for a while and then stopped, and now we're more of a problem than a solution. So I'm encouraged by younger people doing things and talking. And I especially like talking to them about my books because they are very, very willing to share their experiences. It is not like pulling teeth at all. And I find that I found it surprising at first, but now it's something that I expect. And I think that a Google Plus Hangout would be great. Anything, I have a Facebook page, but it's, as my daughter would say, old people ruined Facebook. So maybe Google Plus is a better place, or Tumblr or Instagram or someplace else. So we'll see. I mean, I think it behooves all of us who are, struggling to find ways to grieve their friends and honor their friends, to find ways to reach everybody. And that means younger people in particular. I think the older you get, the more likely you are, but we have to include everybody. We have to include everybody. If the whole culture of grief and death is going to change in our society, it has to come from the younger people. It has to come from them.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I got kicked out of this whole thing. My computer crashed. I'm so sorry. I had to shut down everything. My internet crashed. I don't even know what happened.
Oh, no.
So it's an AT&T problem. Now, this is supposed to go off at 10 o'clock, and I'm not sure that it did or that it will, but you can sign off.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and I look forward to talking to you all again soon.
And thanks, everybody who's listening now and in the future. I'm sorry for that end of program glitch. Please tune in next week. We're going to have Anna Faktorovich, who is a great writer and a publisher of a literary journal. And please check in on YouTube and let your friends know you can watch all the archive shows there. Thanks again, everybody, and good luck with your changes. So, Vicki, you can hang up the red phone now, but that's going to hang up both of us, too.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.